in this panel of Obsessed with Crime. The authors joining up here are Braham Singh. During his career as a suit, Braham Singh wrote extensively on IT and telecommunications. Shifting gears, he now gives us Bombay Swastikal. He also wrote the screenplay for Emperor, a political thriller set in Malaysia and based around their May 1969 race riots. Alison Joseph. She's a London-based crime writer and award-winning radio dramatist. She began writing full-time with the first of her series featuring Sister Agnes, a contemporary detective Catholic nun. Alison also writes a police series featuring Detective Inspector Berenice Killick and has embarked on a new series set in the 1920s and featuring a fictional Agatha Christie as a detective. Ravi Subramanian. He is India's numero uno thriller writer. He is the award-winning author of 9 best-selling books. His 9th book, In the Name of God, which is a thriller based on the mysterious Padmanabha temple in Kerala, released on 26 June 2017. Brijesh Singh, cop by the day, author by night. Brijesh Singh wears multiple hats. He started as an engineer before joining the coveted Indian Police Service and now patrols the internet as the head of cyber police, and also simultaneously handles the public relations departments of the Maharashtra government. And Mr. Piyush Jha is an acclaimed film director, ad filmmaker, and the author of best-selling crime fictional novels. Piyush is developing a crime-based fiction TV show for a leading entertainment channel, The Great Indian Bowel Movement. It's Piyush's return to genre satire that he originally started telling his stories in. And I just came to know Mr. Ravi Subramanian and Brijesh Singh will not be attending. So we have Braham Singh, Alison Joseph, and Piyush Jha on the panel today. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. We're here. There was supposed to be 2 more panelists, but due to some reason they are not here today. So we will have more time with our lovely guests out here. Alison, as you know, has come all the way from England to join us. So please give her a big Pune welcome. And again, from the US, we have Braham Singh. So I'm very honored to have 2 people come all the way from foreign countries for this session. Thank you very much, Braham. It's his debut that he's making and he's very excited. But, as we always say in India, Atiti Deva Bhava. So we will start first with Alison, which means the guest is God. And so we will start with you, because you are our guest in this country. Alison, as everybody, you were just introduced, you are a crime writer, and you've been writing, cozy novels, right? Cozy as in a type of crime novel which was perfected or let's say started by a particular novelist who you are now featuring as a fictional character. So before anything else, would you like to tell us a little bit about the cozy crime novel? Yes.
Yes. I think, you see, it's already controversial, which is just as well as only 3 of us, because I think we've got lots and lots to say, and we would just be interrupting those 2 other guys, even if they'd bothered to turn up. The thing about the cosy, it's an easy word, cosy, and we all think we know what this means, and it's an English country house, and it's nice, polite people, and, a body is found in the library, and it's all very, there aren't guns, there's not bloodshed, there's not, we all think we know what cosy means. But the funny thing is, even if you look at Agatha Christie's best work, it's not cosy, really, and certainly a lot of her contemporaries, because it's crime. We are talking about murder. We're talking about people doing very bad things. And I think when you say cosy, it's quite an interesting category, because it's true. I don't have millions of guns and shootings and danger and torture. I don't have that, but I do have, I hope realistically, people behaving very badly, and one hopes in the course of the story we find out why. So the cosy, non-cosy distinction, I think, breaks down quite quickly. I think particularly in with contemporary crime, with any contemporary crime writing. That said, I have very much enjoyed taking Agatha Christie, who's real, and making her a fictional detective. I've enjoyed it far more than I thought I would. I was so daunted when the publisher said, "Oh, great idea, let's do this." I was very, very daunted by it, but it's such fun because she exists. You know, she's a real person. I can sit in the British Library and read lots and lots of things about her real life. And then I have the option to thread that into my work.
I'm going to ask you a bit more about that, but first I'm going to go from cozy to Nazi, because this is what Braham is doing. And it's very interesting that he has brought a bridge between Berlin and Bombay, the erstwhile Bombay. I'm saying Bombay because the time in which his book is set, it was called Bombay, although it's called Mumbai now. So, Berlin and Bombay, and it's about Nazi Germany and the Jews. And it's a very interesting title called Bombay Swastika. So, Braham, I'd like you to talk about the Nazi Germany aspect of your book and how you relate it to Bombay, India. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, it's got no credit to me. It just so happened. That there was this Jewish gentleman who escaped Nazi Germany, and of all places. And
you all please keep quiet. You're disturbing the people. And if you all want to talk, then you go out there. Okay? Please respect the speakers over here.
So anyway, so like I was saying, there was a gentleman, a German Jewish gentleman, who escaped Nazi Germany and ended up in Bombay, in British India. And so that became the genesis of this plot. And he, in a spectacularly ironical turn of events, he is German and he's in British India. And in 1939, the war breaks out, and he's deemed an enemy alien, and he's he's interned. So the British interned. They just corralled all the Germans in India in those days, and he's put into, I don't know if you're aware, Purandar Fort. Purandar Fort is where he was interned. And there's a whole story in itself, because they didn't categorize between the Jews and the National Socialists or the Nazis. So in the same camp, you had Jews and Nazis just thrown into the same prison. And I tell you, that could be a story in itself, but I don't dwell too much on that. So anyway, so he's incarcerated in India, and because he's German. And then because he's Jewish, his parents are incarcerated in Germany. So talk about a double whammy. So that then became the genesis around which this story I built out. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that a little more in depth. We'll discuss in depth, because he's also brought in very interestingly the nuclear aspirations of India and how they got challenged, in his book. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Alison again one more time. Is that how did you actually start writing within the genre of crime fiction? Because you started off initially as writing stories which were not really crime, more like relationships and romance, etc. Right?
It all rather happened by mistake, although it doesn't look like it now. But yes, I had been working in television, and I had I'd always written. I'd written compulsively as a small child. I was just someone who wrote stories, and it sort of came to a point in my life where I thought, if I'm going to do this, I'll let's just try being a writer. And I was lucky that indeed I wrote some short stories, sort of romance short stories, and they were published in magazines and things, and that gave me the confidence. And I had been reading a lot of crime fiction and sort of thinking about just the strength of that genre, that if you start with a dead body, you've got a story. You know, you've already got something very, very interesting happening. But I hadn't got much further than that. And then I was sort of muttering about how I might do a detective nun. And I met this agent. And I said, I'm going to write a detective nun. And this agent said, I'd like to read that. And I didn't have an agent at the time. So I went home and I thought, I really better write this. So it was kind of accident. But I think I'd already been thinking along those lines. And then the detective nun became a much richer theme than I realised. Because, of course, she believes in a benign universe. She believes that people behave well. And because she's constantly... She works in a hostel for runaway teenagers in London. It's quite gritty and realistic in that, you know, those places exist. And she's in an open order where those sorts of nuns and monks work. So she's already on the edge of society. She's already with people who society forgets about. And it was important for a contemporary novel that she should have access to stuff that the police don't know about, because of course that's quite difficult in a contemporary novel. That, you know, the police, they have the CCTV records, they have mobile phone records, they can actually solve the crime far quicker than a nun normally. But of course she has access to young people on the edge of society who won't want to talk to the police and have secrets themselves. So it kind of went on from there. It became a rich theme.
I got this. So, but I'd like to dig a little deeper out here. But you were into you loved crime fiction. Did you read a lot of crime fiction? What were your favorites? Crime fiction authors, or were your favorites just you did the idea got sparked off by this agent, but you probably knew a lot about the tropes of the genre itself, right? I think
I'm easily bored, and I think if someone's going to give me a story to read, it's got to start. It's terrible, but I want a proper story. I want to turn the pages. So yes, I had read a lot of crime. There's the old established favourites, but actually, we can talk about this more. But the crime genre, obviously in India and also in Europe and America, it's opening up. People are doing astonishingly interesting things within what we call crime or thriller fiction. You can kind of do anything with it, I think. You can talk about anything you want, because structurally it's such a strong story. You've already got big things happening, so your readers there, the readers with you. If you've got a detective, you've got someone leading you through the story. Yeah. So I think it's a fantastic genre to be part of. Yeah.
So, in fact, what I would like to ask you is that although your influences and your favorite authors are more literary, you chose crime as one of the key elements of your book to tell that story, right? Perhaps for the same reasons that Alison has spoken about, so that you could tell a very satisfying story. Is that so?
Yes, actually, before we, you may recall the email from Alison when we were, so all of us, we haven't met each other, and so for this panel we got together on email, and Alison made a comment about how you have the crime thriller as a genre, and then you have stories where you use crime to dwell on a social issue or a political. Something political that's happening. So that's precisely what I did. I'm not a crime writer by any stretch. I'm more of a historical buff. So I take a period in history and I research it to death. In this book, what I've done is exactly what Alison said in that email. Is I've taken a murder. So a tribal boy gets murdered. He gets murdered in a Bombay suburb.
Don't tell the story.
So, but what I'm saying is that murder then leads us to a lot of, leads us to the Indian nuclear program, leads us to the PILF-2017 food aid program. So in this book, it's not a pure, like a cozy crime thriller, but it uses a murder to address a larger
societal issues. Yeah, so exactly the point that when we say crime fiction is not only about detective fiction or solving crimes or being a whodunit. A crime fiction writer is talking about society and essentially talking about society's ills, what is wrong with society. And he uses crime to kind of, bring that wrong and perhaps give the reader a sense of completion, a sense of catharsis, at the end of it, a sense of fulfillment, perhaps, when the case is solved and everything is rosy, the kind of stuff which doesn't really happen in life. But so this crime writer is using social injustice at the basis of it all. Isn't that so, Alison? Would you agree? In your newer writing, you are sort of graduating more and more towards that, or to a larger extent, right?
Yeah, I think that's you're absolutely right. The minute you've got someone who has killed someone, something bad has happened, and as readers, we have to know why. You couldn't just say, "Oh, it was one of those things," So the minute you're saying this has happened and there is a reason why it's happened, then by definition, you're talking about society's ills. And as you say, because it's a novel, it has beginnings, middles, and ends, there should be at least something redemptive. There must, something where you close the book and you feel the right thing has happened.
Well, to expand a little bit about that, most of my understanding about the world came through crime fiction books that I read. Or thrillers or spy thrillers, etc., because they have so much of detailing and geopolitics and tensions between people and etc. That kind of gives you a rich understanding of a period of time, of a place, and it adds to your knowledge base to such a great extent that I think non-fiction or even literary fiction perhaps cannot add, because it also sort of involves you into it. So this idea that crime fiction is bad or is entertainment, and a lot of literary fiction people look down upon crime fiction, is what I'm trying to say does not really exist, because crime fiction does play a very important role. And going from that to you and how you use the political aspect of crime fiction and that murder which sparks off political and social situations within your book. Would you care to expand a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, you just said it, that crime fiction. So let me just mention. I don't know how many of you have read the book or seen the movie Gorky Park by Martin Cruz Smith. If you haven't, you should.
You could see the film also.
Yeah, you should. So Martin Cruz Smith has this Russian detective, Arkady Renko, and he is a stoic detective. Basically a crime story, but if you read those books of his, Gorky Park, Havana Bay, Polar Star, you get a picture into the Russian mind and the Russian environment. I tell you, Martin Cruz Smith, by the way, is American. He's not Russian. And from him, I learned more about the Russian mind than I could learn from Dostoevsky. And that's because he made it, and now I'm coming to the point you raised. He made it entertaining. He used crime, he used murder to show the Russian society, the good and the bad. Arkady Renko is a passionate patriot. He'll never, in the first book, Gorky Park, he's tempted to leave Russia and come to America. He's given all sorts of, he can't. At the end of the day, he's Russian to the core. And those days, remember, we're talking about Soviet Russia. So Martin Cruz Smith used this detective and a crime thriller to teach us, to show us the Russian environment. And so that, I think, influenced me a lot. It influenced quite a few people a lot into writing crime, into using crime or a murder to make to explain to people something about a society they don't know. Someone who reads, hopefully, Bombay Swastika may learn more. So a foreigner, an American or a German, reading this book could learn more about India and our and what we are made up of, and our failings and our strengths, than he could learn from nonfiction. So that I think is a lovely thing to do in storytelling, is to convey a message or teach something to a person, which otherwise he would have to go through a bunch of boring nonfiction books. He gets it here. Well, then that brings me to the next part, that you really, if you want to do that, if you want to write fiction like that, you better get your research right. And so
I'm going to talk to you in depth about the research you did, because it's very interesting, the kind of research that he did. But I first want to ask Alison about the research you do, because to me, I don't think that you have. Perhaps I'm being presumptuous. I don't think you really have any crime were you in the police, or were you involved in crime?
You didn't murder anyone.
Murder someone? No, I don't think so. So how do you do your research? I mean, what
Well, it's the strangest thing about crime writers, is that we're all so lovely. We're such nice people. We're all polite. I'm a member of the British Crime Writers Association.
And she was just a small footnote. She was the chairperson of the British Crime Writers Association. Yeah.
And if you were to see us sort of socially, we're all just lovely, and everyone's kind of asking people how they are. And
I'm a lovely person too.
And we're all lovely. and people are genuinely supportive of each other, and I think it is because it all goes on the page. There's something about our interest in people behaving very badly that it's a great resource to think about it, to write about it. So in terms of research, from what you were saying, there's obviously a world that one's created, and that has to be right. So in fact, the Berenice Killick novel I wrote, where she is a policewoman, it's all about particle physics. I became obsessed with the Large Hadron Collider. And I actually went to CERN, to Switzerland, where they were colliding the particles, and it was the most interesting day of my whole life, to stand in the control room where they have the screens, and they were showing the two beams where they discovered the Higgs boson particle, and I was kind of there around that time, and it was so interesting. It was so fantastic. And I thought, well, this is such a privilege, because I'm making something up. I'm making up a fictional story, but because that bit has to be right, here I am, looking at this happening. And I invented a particle collider in Kent, in East Britain, England, because I wanted the murder to happen within this. I liked this idea of order. I liked this idea of what physicists are doing, of sort of seeing patterns, seeing something created, getting an answer. And I thought it paralleled what my policewoman was doing, which is also trying to see a pattern, see the truth emerging. So what I would say is, it may be fictional, but it has to be true. It isn't real, but it is true. And those are the things you have to get right. Yeah. And certainly in terms of police research, I do that side of it, I try and get right as well.
And I think what Braham, you would sort of agree to this true aspect of it, because most of your research was actually true. I mean, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, it started off as I started off as a true story. This thing, because there was really a person who escaped Nazi Germany and ended up in Bombay. So that's a fact. He was thrown into Purandar Fort. It's a fact. His parents were incarcerated in Germany and then shot in Riga. That's a fact. So all these facts came together to make it would have been a wonderful true story, except for another fact that he had a daughter in Florida who threatened to sue me if I dared write a true story about her father, estranged father. So that then gave me the opportunity to go for broke, and I'm going to write fiction, and that was the best decision I made. But it was based on facts. It was all based on facts. And if you what I saw as a reader, I mean, you can't write if you don't read. That's another fact. And as a reader, I found growing up that if I found something wrong or I found an error in something that a writer has written, I lost respect for the whole narrative, and I didn't read the book. So that used to petrify me. And so I spent, in the years I took to write the book, I spent the larger part of it in research. And the first editor who saw this book was in New York, and she said to me that, you are one of the best researchers I have read and one of the lousiest writers I've read. So, so since then I focused on my writing.
Yeah, because, there's this whole thing that sometimes you research it so much, you get bogged down in the research. And you know so much that you want to kind of, bring it all on the page, and I want to share this. So it's always that juggling act that one has to kind of do, right?
What I learnt was to research as late as possible in the process, not to start with the research, which is but actually to write and write and write until you actually know what questions you want to answer.
I started leaving fill in the blanks. I started leaving blanks. So I would write this. So eventually write the story, then leave blanks, and where the blanks are, then go and research that. Because she's absolutely right. You can get so caught up in the research that you'll take 10 years to write a book that should take 2. Yeah.
And sometimes the story changes even, after you find the bits of research which you say, no, hey, I thought this was right, but actually this is right, so I have to change it to kind of go in that direction. Isn't that true?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no right or wrong, really. I mean, if I found that I was wrong on a hypothesis I threw up in my head, well, then that leads me through another path for the story. So as long as you have a vivid imagination, which was the bane of my school days, you can see my school results and you'll know it helped me here, yes.
So I'm going to just segue a little bit and talk about Agatha Christie as a character. It's really interesting. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been there haven't been too many real life people depicted as fictional characters in books. I'm not sure. The only one which I sort of remember is Alfred Hitchcock in the Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators series. I don't know if some people perhaps know that. I don't know. I think nobody knows that. But so how did you decide to use Agatha Christie, and weren't you a little worried that people are going to, point fingers? No, she didn't do this, she didn't look like that, and etc., etc., etc.
Well, that's been the funny thing about it, because I read and read and read about her, and what I've done for the 3 novels so far is she's quite a young woman. The first is when she's married. She was married to Archie Christie when she was quite young. And then there was the First World War. Almost immediately they'd got married, so they hardly saw each other. So then the marriage kind of continued after the First World War, but not very happily, and he left her for somebody else. In 1926, she did this famous disappearance. And the poor woman, I mean, she'd gone mad. She'd had a breakdown, but she was on the front page of all the British newspapers, the search for Mrs. Christie. And she was such a private woman. And it was, awful. She never mentioned it. In fact, apparently, if anybody interviewing her said, oh, and what about your flight to Harrogate? She just wouldn't speak to them ever again. Then, some years later, she met an archaeologist called Max Mallowan, and they had a very long and happy marriage, to the extent that her grandson, who I know, he said no one quite told him that this man wasn't his grandfather until he was in his teens, because it was just this sort of happy family life. So I was sort of thinking, I didn't want to do the disappearance to Harrogate or the breakdown. I didn't want to be disrespectful to her in that way. But I liked this idea of a marriage intention being a kind of backbone to the story. It's true of my Sister Agnes books as well. Sister Agnes is constantly thinking perhaps she ought to leave the order, and that gives this nice kind of tension to the story apart from the murder mystery. So what I've tried to do is be true to what I think she was. So obviously the way my stories play out, like the most recent one is called Death in Disguise, and it's a murder that happens in a theatre. Now, Agatha Christie in real life was not at this theatre with these people on that night, because everyone else is fictional. But she liked the theatre, she went to the theatre, it's in a part of London that she went to. I hope I've reflected as I say, the truth of her life.
And how have the fans of Agatha Christie taken it? Have they kind of said sacrilege or, oh, thank you very much? What?
Something in between. The funny thing is, of course, when people say Agatha Christie, we think of this lovely elderly lady with grey hair who's rather rich and very, very respectable. And because I'm writing her in her 20s, 30s, she was really writing for fun. She was a wife and a mother, and she was beginning to write these crime novels. And then her husband left her, and she was a single mother with very little money. And of course, nobody thinks of her that way. No one thinks of her as a struggling young woman thinking, what on earth do I do now? And of course, it was very shaming in those days. To be divorced, it was terribly shaming. So the fans who like her to be their favourite grandmother are slightly challenged by this rather impoverished, slightly, not miserable, but sort of lost person trying to think about her life. But bless her, she did, in a way, what we all do. She thought, well, I can write. This is going to be my living. And so then she started writing Poirot, and Poirot took off quite quickly. And actually, she went off him very quickly, but he was the bread and butter at that point. So she carried on writing Poirot dutifully. Bless her.
Yeah, people tend to think of Miss Marple as Agatha Christie, okay? Yeah. So coming to your protagonist, and I think it's very interesting to have a German Jew in Mumbai and in the 60s, and what would be his motivations to kind of do what he does in the book?
Well, he's a the Jewish people are. I've in America I've come across Jewish Buddhists, Jewish Hindus. Somehow they chilled out over centuries of persecution. They kind of chilled out. So, of course, Israel today is not chilled out by any stretch of imagination. But by and large, a large segment of Jewish people are very chilled, just by nature of, I guess, the way their religion has moved across time. And so the protagonist here is actually a Jewish Hindu. He delves into Hinduism very deeply, and he delves into
He's a Hindu.
He's a Hindu. Hindu, and then he actually delves into I don't know how many of you are aware of the Sahajiyas. It's a sect in Bengal which takes Lord Krishna's dalliances very literally. So he delves into that, and forms his motivation really is he's compelled. He's a reluctant hero. He wants to just lead his life the way it is. He's not very successful. There's a line there in the book that in India he was a white man. In Germany he was a Jew, and so just by virtue of being white in India, he manages to. And so with that, I use that as a way to also show our fascination with our colonial heritage and skin color. So he himself admits that besides being white, there's nothing else I have to show for myself in life. And he's plodding along in India. He's plodding along, not very successful, living off the crumbs of more successful Jews. I don't know if you guys are aware, Bombay is a Jewish city. I don't know if you're aware.
Yeah, we know that.
You know that, right? The Sassoons. Yes. Okay. Good. Because today, if I go to anyone in Mumbai and I ask them, "Do you know about the Sassoons?" and they'll say, "Who?" And the Sassoons built the city. They financed the Gateway of India.
Sassoon Dock, Sassoon Library, the whole of synagogues,
the whole of South India. The whole of South Bombay is built by the Sassoons. And then the last Sassoon, Victor Sassoon, actually left India after independence and went to Shanghai. And if you go across the Bund, all the buildings around the Bund are built by him. So they built Bombay, then they built Shanghai. So they're remarkable people. But Ernst, my protagonist, he lives off the crumbs of these rich Jews, and he is compelled by events to become a hero. So it's nothing that what motivates him. So he's reluctant
hero.
Reluctant hero.
Well, that's a very interesting protagonist to have, because you sort of have a person who's looking the other way and suddenly is thrown into a circumstance, is forced into a circumstance, and then rises to his own heroic, to understand
his own potential.
That's a trope of crime fiction writers. So it's well used by a lot of people, I believe that crime fiction has got so many different, styles and tropes. Like we talked about cozy, and now we're talking about a hero of circumstances. I think what I'd like Alison to do is, if possible, share a bit of your, wisdom regarding crime fiction with perhaps writers who are sitting in the audience who are sort of interested in crime fiction, have read crime fiction, but don't know how to tackle it as writers.
My wisdom, gosh.
Yes.
There are, I think, who was it said? There are 3 rules of writing and nobody knows what they are. I get asked a lot, does one start with plot? Does one start with character? Does one start with story structure? We talked about this a bit yesterday. You kind of start with a story. You start with a sort of, wouldn't it be interesting if? I think the detective is important. I think once you've got your central detective character, then their concerns will dictate the story up to a point, and the world that they inhabit will dictate the story. And I think also that one should distinguish between crime, detective fiction and thriller fiction. I say, well, the detective fiction, something has happened and we find out why, and the thriller structure is something awful is about to happen and our hero or heroine is trying to prevent
Stop
that.
it. Yeah.
And I think there are as many ways of writing a story as there are writers. With crime fiction people, we sort of talk about, some people will paper the walls of their study with bits of paper and write the structure, or have great big rolls of paper on the floor with everything marked out. And I just think, gosh, my study's enough of a mess without doing that to it. And equally, some people really do just start and think anything could happen and I will just follow the characters. I'm actually increasingly, the more I talk to people who want to write or are trying to write, I'm more interested in the techniques, not for doing it, but for preventing the things that are preventing you from doing it, from sort of all the little tricks that, the things even now, one will start a new book and think, just because I could do it before doesn't mean I can do it now. And in fact, sometimes I'll be checking one of my previous books for a detail about Sister Agnes's life, and I'll be reading it and I'll be thinking, this is good, who wrote this? Yeah. And then it's actually very depressing because I think, I'll never be as good as I was then. So I think the mind can get in the way. I think, it is true. It's lovely to write. People have stories they want to tell, and a lot of the knack is doing it, and determination. Really, I'm sure we all 3 have, examples of moments where we thought, I'm giving up, this is no good, I can't. Yeah. And somehow doing it, somehow just deciding, I'm going to keep doing this.
One of the things you mentioned was about detective fiction. So the term detective in India, I found, I've sort of interacted with a lot of people, and they always have this idea that detective means Karamchand, or detective means Sherlock Holmes. It has to wear a trench coat and dark glasses and, a hat and or be a police man. So I think what Alison has demonstrated in many ways in her writing is that a detective need not be any of these. In her case, her detective, when she started off, was a nun, Sister Agnes. And just because she was interested in reaching to the conclusion or sort of getting to the bottom of it, she became the detective that she is. And she's interestingly used Agatha Christie as a detective. So you can actually use any person as a detective, but you have to kind of give that person a certain...
What I've discovered, the detective is your best friend. The detective is the person that comes with you through the story. And also, if you're reading it, the detective is the reader's best friend. It's the best thing to have. It means, as writers, we can hide behind the detective. Alison Joseph doesn't have to be there, but Sister Agnes is there, or Agatha Christie. So when I say Agatha Christie as a detective, what I'm doing is making her that person who leads you through the story. And actually, reluctantly, as you were saying, she's quite often, the police will say, oh, you'll have a view about this, Mrs. Christie. And she'll say, I just write it. And she's really not interested, but of course she's the one who notices something, sees something, talks to somebody, and starts to have that privileged information.
But tell me something. You also perhaps would have wanted to bring, use the detective as the kind of way to tell your story. But you used a character like Ernst. So if you'd like to try to throw a bit of light on how Ernst kind of discovers himself even while on the journey of kind of getting to the bottom of the...
Well, like I said...
Without giving out your story.
Of course. He keeps warning me because he knows I'm a novice. I'm just about give a
Sometimes
spoiler.
writers speak a lot and they kind of give out the story and then
yes.
say, "Acha, wo to sab pata chal gaya, abhi to padhne ka zarurat hai."
He's keeping a watch on looking after me, making sure you guys buy the book. So
This is the book, by the way, Bombay Swastika. So by Om Books, and it's going to be out when?
yeah, it's out end of September, but you can go on Amazon right now and get it for very
Bombay
low,
Swastika for you.
$275 is low price.
Yeah.
But
The plug is done.
I had to plug. Come on, guys.
Okay.
It's the American thing to do, isn't it? But no, he again is up to a point. Up to a point he is pushed, he's edged on by circumstances. So really, he doesn't want to. And in fact, his associate, who is a young Muslim Marxist, that's the other, and I'm not giving out anything, who actually is impatient with the way Ernst kind of deals with life. And he says at one point that, hey, you Germans are supposed to be the technology kings. Why does everything come to me? And that's because Ernst is a reluctant hero all throughout. Until what they have in script writing they call the central ordeal. Until then, Ernst is just edged. He is forced to take a course of action until something happens, and that then. After that, he becomes the proactive hero, which we are used to. So, in answer to your question, really, circumstances are what lead him to a particular point after which he takes over.
So, you know what? I think we have between us a fair amount of knowledge about crime fiction, and I can see that some people are pretty interested because they're talking amongst themselves. So perhaps they can. It's time to open it to questions so that you can talk to us instead of talking to yourselves, ladies. All right. So I'm going to open it up to questions and okay. So I'm going to start with a lady. Yes. I'll come to you. Don't worry. Yeah. Go. Can you mic, please? Because I think we need a couple of mics in the audience. Please keep it there. The mic doesn't work. We need another mic.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
So my question was that while writing a crime fiction, how important is studying human psychology?
Yeah, I think, Alison, would you like to take that?
I think human psychology is at the absolute heart of crime fiction. I'm not sure about studying it other than, well, as my friends will tell you, I'm so nosy. And I just ask people lots and lots of questions. they're not too bored by me. There has to be a curiosity about human beings, because you're saying this person has done something that most of us don't do, which is kill someone, and why? Why would they do that? And also, I think you have to think about motives. Love, revenge, rage. It's quite often big, essential things that are part of the human mind.
So you do that through interactions with people?
I do. As I say, I'm very, very nosy. Oh, and also reading the newspaper. All those little tiny bits in the newspaper where it will talk about a crime.
The newspaper is a great, not the front page, but those little things, the guy, suddenly there was this guy in Rochester whose wife was found with a cleaver and he was in the bar. And now what happened really? Just that one little 3-line thing fascinated me. So the newspaper is a great source of inspiration for all of us.
Also, I'd like to add, because I am a student of psychology. I have graduated in psychology. So I find that most of the time when I'm writing, I am going back to that time when I was studying psychology and, working that into my writing, drawing things from there and using it. So I think it would help to get a education in psychology, and if you don't have time to get an education, at least read some books. It'll always help.
It shows in your books. I read one of your books and it's very clear. The man knows he knows the mind.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. The gentleman there.
My question is to anybody who can answer it. Why is it that a lot of crime fiction or detective novels, we see you have the stereotypical detective, messy hair, constantly smokes, constantly drinks, doesn't know how to dress. When well, it's not a book, but Anthony Horowitz created and produced a fantastic TV series called Foyle's War in England. Why can't we have a detective who's more sober, quiet, isn't too emotional or too dramatic in his exterior?
Okay, I'll just answer that quickly. See, I think for every wild-haired detective there is a well-groomed one. I mean, for a while, Karamchand, you have Detective Foyle, you have Inspector Morse, Urbane, you have so many other Poirot, for example, Miss Marple. So I mean, they're and even now contemporary detectives who are not necessarily flawed in their ways. Sister Agnes, for example, is a nun. She, so you'd like to say a bit of that?
She doesn't look anything as you've just described. But where I'd say you kind of do need a flaw, it doesn't need to be. I think you're right. You can get into cliche with them looking flawed, and they don't need to look flawed. But I think for it to be interesting, particularly for me, interesting to write, my detective has to have their own tensions, their own possibilities. So, I mean, quite often in a Sister Agnes novel, there's something going on that is making her doubt her vocation in some way. The most recent one, her father's died, but all this family information has come to her, and she's begun to see her decision to be a nun in a completely new light, and it's making her very unhappy. So that's kind of a starting point. I think otherwise it wouldn't be interesting to write. I think a detective who was just sort of fine, having a nice life.
You'd get an American TV series. I mean, really, if otherwise. I mean, I despair back home for flawed detectives, because there you have these absolutely manicured, very good looking. I mean, in LA, what's that, the Law and Order, for example, for Christ's sake, can you show me a normal person? So I get your point, but by and large, the flaws in any hero are what makes for a good story, whether it's a detective or any other genre. The flaws are key. Now, of course, if we kind of make it stereotypical, or if we overuse something, that's unfortunate. But by and large, flaws in a character is what makes the character worth a read, richer.
Richer. Yes. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Please. She's got the mic. Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask is, while writing crime fiction, basically what happens is there's a murder, then there is lots of action. We know the detective, who the detective is, their background, everything. There's high action, there's high octane action, and in the end it's the climax and everything gets tied into a nice little bow. So what I wanted to ask is, because I have tried writing crime fiction two or three times, and what has happened with me was, while writing the story, while writing the climax or the action, the high octane action, things have gotten too complicated, and I just couldn't, end the thing, because, sometimes things get so complicated, you don't get the answer. Like, sometimes it so happens that who is the murderer, finally, you never, come to know.
You don't know who your murderer is?
No.
Quite possible at times. You get carried away, and
Yeah, so you get completely carried away. So as writers, I wanted to ask you that while writing crime fiction, you know the murderer, you know the detective, you know the story, but sometimes in between it gets very complicated. So what kind of things to include and what to leave out? Like, if you could just...
I think that is the key. I mean, I think that must be what we all struggle with. Is it? My friend Gilda, who's a writer, used to say that writing a book was a beginning, a muddle, and an end. And there is that middle bit, because particularly if it's a classic detective story, you're quite right. You've got lots of suspects. You've got to keep all those possibilities going. You've got to allow the reader to think, oh, maybe it was him, or maybe it was her, or she's got a motive. And you have to keep all that going. And then also, one hopes, surprise the reader as well by saying, but. It is the most difficult thing. And I think the complication is I have to watch myself, because if I start doubting, if I think this suspect's too obvious, I'm only halfway through and it's very clear this person did it, I'll have another character, or let's start another person who could have done. So I'll go back and thread in yet another person, by which time, as you say, you're 3/4 of the way through and I've lost track of who everybody is. I think it's one of the nice things about a thriller structure is you can uncomplicate it. There's a thing that's going to happen and you can be with your hero trying to prevent that. It can be very clear and very simple in comparison.
One of the things you could do is to take a big chart paper and draw the path. So you should, like you said, if you know the beginning and the end, it's the middle which is the problem. So you start plotting your points visually when you can see it, like a GPS thing, system. And so when you know that you're going off track, you kind of, bring yourself back to the path, and perhaps that might help you visually to keep track. I don't do it, but I think it might be helpful to someone like you who kind of loses track.
If I may just add, and this is only, it worked for me, I don't know if it'll work generally, but I found, a mentor of mine, she forced me to write movie scripts. Now, movie scripts are unforgiving, and they are a very good discipline. 110 pages. In the first 10 pages, you've got to have an inciting incident, then you've got to have a turning point, you've got to have a central ordeal, you've got a turning point too, you've got a twist in the tail, and it all has to happen in 110 pages. I would draw that arc of the story as in a movie script, and then work from there. And so if something gets too complicated, I'll take a little break, come back, and then add to that arc. But the discipline, the whole trick is the discipline. So at the same time, you don't want to lose. Don't make it simple. I mean, don't lose the complication, but keep it disciplined within the arc of the story, and you'll be fine. It just takes a bit of doing. That's all. Just keep at it.
Talking about movie scripts, I think so. I had never written novels before in my life. I just started writing a few years back. I'd never written stories in my life, nothing. I just wrote movie scripts for my own films. And I was adept at writing screenwriting. And then one day I started just writing. And it all came. And I think it was because of the training that
you would have found it much easier than us, because he's been disciplined by the movie script.
Right.
It's very unforgiving, like I said. Right. And so for him, writing a novel would be easy because of that.
I don't think it's easy, but I think it was the structure was
easier.
Yeah, the structure was not a problem for me. Yeah, which is the struggle that you have. Yeah. Okay, the lady here. Yeah, I'll come to you. Yeah. Mike.
Hi, my question has nothing to do with crime, but in terms of research, especially Brahm, because you are setting it in an era which was, something factual, and also a character that, you were denied rights to write about. So what kind of research do you do? What kind of sources? I mean, are these sources in public domain? So what are the sources that you use to, research?
Today, research is, if you can just frame your question properly and Google it, you're on your way. It's so. If you ask the right question on Google, you'll get a plethora of sources to go to. So that's what I would do, and then you would hone in on what you need, and then eventually you would have to go to that place, you would have to visit that person, or you can't avoid that. So you can't avoid that. Otherwise, everyone, Google is available to everyone. Everyone will.
But it can be prejudice also, you have to be...
Of course, absolutely. All I'm saying is Google can give you a start, right? And then you have to use your own faculties to understand what is it you need researched, and then you have to go there. I mean, I had to spend time in Berlin. I had to spend time in India House in London. You can't. I had to spend time in the archives in Delhi. You can't escape that hard work. There's just no way. I had to go to Tel Aviv. You can't escape the hard work.
So, time's up, but I will give one last question to that girl out there because I promised. Yes. Let's go really fast. The mic is gone. They've taken the mic. Say it
Make
loudly.
it very fast. No problem.
I just wanted to say that whenever we start talking about the culprit, probably sometimes he's a victim as well. Like
Right.
I've read Sydney Sheldon, like most of the books. And it's always the culprit who is actually the victim, probably going through some psychological problems. So I would like to know more about what your angle, or how you get into the shoes of the culprit who is actually the victim.
Very long question for the last. Very
It's
long
a,
answer.
I think that kind of a question needs to be answered like outside somewhere.
Yeah.
If
Come
you
and
buy
talk
us
to
a cup
us.
of tea,
Yes.
right? Okay. All right. Okay, so thank you very much, Alison and Braham, to be here. Thank you for the audience. Thank you very much for being participative, and thank you Pune Lit Fest and Manjari for giving us the opportunity to share our work with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all the panelists and moderator, for this most interesting discussion.